Hello, and welcome to part one of this three-part series that is about United States monuments, statues, and American civil religion, which I have titled Monumentgate, How We Got Here and What We Can Do to Fix It. My name is Stephen Pierce. I am the host of this new YouTube channel that is going to be dedicated to exploring little-known and misrepresented facts in American history. This channel is titled Let It Begin Here because it is what the militia captain John Parker allegedly said to his men as the British Army approached them at Lexington Green. He said to them, "Stand your ground. Don't fire unless fired upon. But if they mean to have a war, let it begin here." Basically, drawing a line in the sand against the biggest army the world had ever seen at that point. Which is what I will be attempting to do against misinformation about our past.
History began on July 4th, 1776. Everything before that was a mistake.
Before I begin on the topic though, I wanted to just thank from the bottom of my heart all my friends and family who have given me great support throughout this entire time setting up the channel. I really hope I live up to your expectations in terms of giving entertaining quality about our history, and the ultimate goal of this channel is to get average people to be interested and to think deeper about our history and how we can use it to create a more perfect union. And I cannot do this alone. So please, leave constructive criticism in the comment section below, that way I can improve as a content creator. Give me suggestion ideas for future episodes. Subscribe and hit the bell for future notifications about this channel. And finally, like all our social media pages in the description below.
Before we get started, does anyone want to get out?
Thank you all so much. I'm so excited about this. Now let's get to it. So unless you live under a rock, you've probably been seeing on the news stories about statues coming down, memorials becoming vandalized, all stemming from the deaths of George Floyd, Breonna Taylor, and Ahmaud Arbery, which is all part of a conversation about systemic racism in the United States, which I'm glad we are finally having on a large and deep scale. Now, in order to have a good, productive conversation about the memorialization of our past and the racial dynamics that come with it, we have to go even before the Civil War into the colonial period and attempt to answer these questions. How did colonial settlers perceive, preserve, and cherish their past? How did the American Revolution change and challenge those concepts of the past? How did the American Revolution change the way George Washington was remembered through American society? What did George Washington think about public works to him? And finally, how did the Founding Fathers want to memorialize the American Revolution along with their own accomplishments?
We have to get on, we have so much time and so little to do. Strike that, reverse it. This way, please.
I also would just like to note that on a personal level, this has been a very challenging topic for me to look at. The past couple of weeks, the events that have been taking place have been very hard to watch. I'm always inspired when I go on vacation or when I go to Philadelphia and I see these sculptures and I take a picture with one of them. I know, because I'm that much of a nerd! And yes, I could just be this entire time in this video complaining about how horrible the rioters are pulling down all these public artworks, but I'm not going to, because I'm actually going to challenge myself in looking at the history of these monuments and statues rather than just complaining all the time like I'm seeing on the news. I challenge you to go and do more research, make yourself become more uncomfortable with this topic, learn more, talk to other people who do not look like you, who may have a different perception on what these public artworks are about. I implore you though, as American citizens or as people of the world citizens, to use this channel for some form of context when you're having that educational talk. Shameless plug, sorry. But it is your responsibility to do your own research as well. Don't just rely on me. Use my content as some kind of building block for something that we can all create in terms of solutions for the current situation that we're in. Because complaining about this all the time is going to get us nowhere. Absolutely nowhere. We need to have conversations with facts and perspectives about other people who live among us. Okay, on to the history. Statues and monuments have been symbols for civilizations since the beginning of the human race. They can be symbols of oppression, hope, progress, etc. They have multifaceted purposes, which is all part of a concept the French political theorist Rousseau coined as civil religion. This is loosely defined as a combination of religious symbols and rituals with expressions of nationalism/patriotism and identity. Some features of American civil religion appear in the celebration of national holidays like July 4th, visits to national monuments like the Lincoln Memorial, and respect for national documents like the Declaration of Independence.
I'm gonna steal the Declaration of Independence.
So you would assume with that kind of definition that a lot of the European explorers who settled on the North American continent would want to celebrate their discoveries with statues, memorials, and monuments all across the new nation that they founded, right? Well, not exactly. There was no doubt that there were celebrations throughout the colonies of the ancestors who toiled before them in establishing these civilizations, like in Massachusetts with the Pilgrims and the Puritans, or William Penn and the Quakers in Pennsylvania. There were celebrations, just very few memorials and statues.
What?
So why is this the case, you may ask? Well, three main reasons. One, most of America were rural farm towns. If they were going to build a monument in one of these areas, not a lot of people were going to see them. The only one I can really think of is Plymouth Rock, which is a very simple design, and it was made in the 1700s to memorialize the pilgrims who came in the 1600s. Number two, most of the industrial capabilities of churning out a bunch of statues made out of bronze or metal was not designed yet. It wasn't in America and was starting to begin in Europe in some parts. But most people, when they made these memorials and statues, used chisel tools made out of marble and clay. And most of the skilled artisans were back in Europe, not in America at this point. And number three, all the big cities at this point, Philadelphia, Boston, Charleston, New York, they all have big harbors and ports in their areas. So people are coming in and out from all over the world, and people thought that they would do damage to them. And also, you're at the mercy of the ocean if a big storm comes through or something like that. And they didn't have the kind of landmark protections like we do today. They didn't have people who would take care of them as diligently. So if you have something made out of marble or of bronze, it's going to rust or wither away really easily. And they also felt like in cities where big groups of people are, a statue might actually incite a riot, which we will get to in a second. But don't take my word for it. Let's check out historian Sally Webster's take on this, stating in her book, American memorialization was expressed by a lesser order of objects such as mezzotint engravings of divines, dedicatory silver, and marble plaques in churches. But before the 1760s, no public outdoor sculpture, nor were there many civic amenities since the North American cities were still harbor towns occupied by sailors, traders, land speculators, and itinerant British administrators who served as the royal governors or oversaw the interests of the absentee landowners. We then cut to the beginning of the American Revolution in 1765, as the Sons of Liberty were created to fight off against the British Parliament's new taxes on everyday products like tea, sugar, and stamps. They decry no taxation without representation. No matter what legislation Parliament put forward, it did not satisfy the colonists. Notice I said the word Parliament. You see, unlike what popular history would tell you, many of the colonists did not mind King George III. In fact, they wanted the king to override Parliament's decisions in terms of these new taxes. I will definitely do an episode that goes more in depth on this subject, but for the meantime, check out this wonderful book that really goes into it. So to show their appreciation for the king, the New York General Assembly commissioned a statue to be made of him and William Pitt, his closest advisor who was sympathetic to the colonists' demands. It was commissioned on June 23, 1766 by the New York General Assembly because, quote, "The innumerable and singular benefits received from our most gracious sovereign since the commencement of his auspicious reign, during which they have been protected from the fury of a cruel, merciless, and savage enemy, and lately from the utmost confusion and distress, by the repeal of the Stamp Act." And yes, I will be doing these types of impressions throughout the entire series. Let me know what you think about them. The English sculptor Joseph Wilton got commissioned to do this project and based it on this sculpture of Marcus Aurelius on his horse. King George is depicted in all the Roman attire like the Roman emperor, and it was shipped over to New York in 1771. In 1773, New York City passed anti-graffiti and desecration laws to prevent vandalism against the monument. They also put up a protective cast iron fence that was built along the perimeter of the park, and the fence is still intact today, making it the city's oldest fence allegedly. And basically, that is the end of the love fest between King George III and the colonies, because things just start to get from bad to worse.
It's clobbering time.
More violence starts to escalate, and in 1774, the First Continental Congress meets in Carpenter's Hall in Philadelphia to create an olive branch petition to King George III, which he refuses. When the king refuses the peace treaty, the colonists now see that the entire system is now against them. It's entirely corrupted in their minds. And of course, it's easier to blame one person for all the troubles than blaming a body that is filled with hundreds of people where, it's hard to pick out and choose who are the actual culprits of that. You can just blame it all on the king or the head of state at that point. Then on July 9th, 1776, 7 days after its adoption by the Second Continental Congress, the Declaration of Independence was read aloud to citizens of New York, where they ended up going into a riotous mode and pulled down the statue of King George III, a symbol of liberation, which became a symbol of tyranny. And they did not just tear the statue down, they dismembered it. The rioters first beheaded the statue, took the rest of it down, and then took ornaments from the fencing areas. And then all of the metal was then hauled to a place called Lynchfield, Connecticut, which had an armaments factory that was mostly run by women because all the men in the area went into the militia. And it was smelted down into 42,088 cartridges for muskets. And according to the historian Stanley Weintraub, as the news reached other colonies, statues of imperial worthies were dismantled, and the effigies of the king were either burned or exploded or buried, as in Savannah. There, Georgians listened to a reading of the Declaration at the courthouse steps, after which a spokesman declared, "We therefore commit his political existence to the ground, corruption to corruption, tyranny to the grave." And in regards to the William Pitt statue, I don't know if it happened before or after the King George III statue got pulled down, but apparently it was the British soldiers that actually destroyed that statue because they saw Pitt more as this symbol of the colonists being independent rather than King George. Very, very strange. I don't know. I need to know more about that. If anyone wants to look into that, go right ahead. So while this stapled moment of the American Revolution has been depicted through numerous paintings, different types of mediums, apparently even the left arm of King George was sold for $200,000. Yes, you heard that right, a couple of years ago. It's even depicted in the movie Revolution, a not so good movie starring... Wait, am I seeing this correctly?
Shut up, Ralph! Shut up!
My bad. My bad.
Out of order. Who the hell do you think you're talking to?
Just when you think 2020 couldn't get any worse, now you're in the middle of a beef with Al Pacino. Dude, it's a movie from 1985. Get over yourself.
Brother, You are going down.
I just can't win. So I think overall this is a very misunderstood moment in the American Revolution, and one that should really be looked at more, because it shows how a symbol can really change its meaning in the matter of years like that. So you know the rest of the story, right? We win the war in 1783, establish a new government in 1787 with the Constitution, elect George Washington as our first president in 1789, and then to celebrate our momentous occasion as a new nation, we create a bunch of new statues, memorials, etc., etc., and we live happily ever after. Right?
Wrong.
While there were tons of celebrations for the drafting ratification of the Constitution, along with the unanimous Electoral College victory of George Washington, there was still tons of doubt whether or not the American experiment would succeed. From the get-go, President Washington's critics began chipping away his reputation. Right after he was elected, a cartoon titled The Entry was published in New York depicting Washington entering the capital city, which at that point was Philadelphia, on a jackass, led by his worshipful aide David Humphreys, paired with the couplet, "The glorious time has come to pass, when David shall conduct an ass." And things certainly didn't get any easier from there. In 1792, Washington had to go and crush a rebellion in western Pennsylvania that was made up of mostly farmers who were mad about Alexander Hamilton's proposed whiskey tax, which was then enforced by Washington. And it was crushed very quickly. It was the first time ever, and the only time ever, that a sitting president got into full military gear to crush a rebellion in the United States of America. And then a year after that, in 1793, Washington then creates the Neutrality Proclamation, which basically says we're not getting involved in the French Revolution or any of the European conflicts, which makes a ton of Americans mad, because Washington then is basically betraying the French who helped us win our independence, and they're fighting for the same causes of liberty and independence as we did in 1776. It looked like George Washington was turning into King George III. President Washington's lack of solidarity with the French revolutionaries became nothing but red meat for the partisan press. In one broadside titled "The Funeral of George Washington," it showed the president described as a tyrannical executive on the guillotine, just like Louis XVI in France. Known for having a temper, the president became enraged when he saw this broadside. Thomas Jefferson, seeing this episode, stated that Washington rather be in his grave than in the present situation, that he would rather be on his farm than made emperor of the world. On top of everything else Washington is dealing with currently, he also wants to negotiate a treaty with Great Britain to resolve a lot of the issues that the Treaty of Paris had, which was the document that ended the American Revolution. Now, a lot of Americans do not want to negotiate with Great Britain because they are the adversary of France, and many Americans are sympathetic to the French, including Thomas Jefferson. What became known as Jay's Treaty, named after John Jay, our first Chief Supreme Court Justice and the negotiator of the whole deal, was passed primarily on party lines. This partisan vote made the American people question how valid this democracy was, and it got really ugly. How ugly, you may ask? Well, don't take my word for it, take Washington's word for it. This is from the miniseries John Adams.
Hellhounds are in full cry. They say I have sold this country to England, that I have sided with the mad English king or the French Republic. My desk overflows with memorials, petitions, addresses, resolutions, remonstrances from every corner of the country, all urging me to refuse my signature, declaring I'm a traitor because I've sided with the mad English king over the French Republic. Chief Justice Jay informs me that he could steer a course from one end of the country to the other by the light of his own burning effigies. I do not approve of everything in that treaty, but at least it keeps us out of their blasted war. I know what it is to be unpopular, Mr. Adams. I am weary of the task. most weary.
This is a drawing of what Jay's burning in effigy looked like throughout the entire East Coast. And he also forgot to mention, Washington did, that Alexander Hamilton was getting pelted with rocks anywhere he went because of his advocacy of the treaty. During the treaty's negotiation, a group of Revolutionary War veterans in Virginia gathered for a dinner, raised their glass, and proposed a toast to the speedy death of George Washington. Even Thomas Paine attacked the president for his recent actions. This is a man who dedicated his book, The Rights of Man, to Washington, and inspired the president so much that John Adams stated, "Without the pen of the author of Common Sense, the sword of Washington would have been raised in vain." Paine thought Washington was betraying the American Revolution by not helping France's, stating in July of 1796 to the president after the ratification of the treaty, "The world will be troubled to decide whether you are an apostate or an impostor, whether you have abandoned good principles or whether you ever had any."
Damn!
So why did I mention all these instances of resistance against Washington's administration? Well, there are multiple reasons for this. One is to show that the myth that Washington could have become a king was not true, both because the people would not allow him to be, and Washington himself did not want to become a king. It is also super important to look at that historical context as we dive into how the public wanted to perceive Washington in their public art. So as we see public art today in America, George Washington is one of the most depicted men in American history. He's all over the place. But throughout his life, he only posed for 3 sculptures that I could find, and only one was fully completed. Washington was highly sought after subject for artists, of course, but in the words of H. Nicholas B. Clark, the demand for sculpture representations of him in this country was modest, confined primarily at the first to architectural decoration, gravestones, ships' figureheads, and trade signs. But every single artist was gunning for this one commission that was proposed by the Confederation Congress on August 7th, 1783, which states that an equestrian statue of General Washington be erected at the place where the residence of Congress shall be established, in honor of George Washington, the illustrious Commander-in-Chief of the armies of the United States of America, during the war which vindicated and secured their liberty, sovereignty, and independence. To which, after you read that, you think to yourself, wait, doesn't that sound a lot like what the New York General Assembly said about another guy named George who they depicted on a horse in the middle of a huge city? Did they not understand that something might happen to that? Anyways, the first person to go and take on this commission from the Congress was a man named Joseph Wright. He was the only American to sculpt Washington and was the son of a very famous sculptor named Patience Wright, who was American as well, who went over to Britain a lot to do a lot of pieces for British officials. Now, it's very rare because most Europeans went over to America, not vice versa in terms of art, because they lacked the industrial quality, like I said. Wright wanted Washington to wear a full-blown Roman toga, and I think there's 2 reasons for that. One, basically, is because all the sculptors, all the artists back in the day, they were studying a lot of works from antiquity, so that's what they were kind of normally used to working with. And the second reason is, I think a lot of Americans and even the founders themselves felt like they wanted to emulate the Roman Republic rather than the British Empire.
I'm not Jewish, I'm a Roman. A woman? No, Roman.
Washington refused to wear the toga, and because of that, Wright only got the head part done of the entire sculpture. So he did not get the commission. Now, there was a second person that was gunning for this commission, an Italian sculptor named Giuseppe Geracchi. Hopefully I'm pronouncing that correctly. I know I'm Italian, but I still probably may have butchered that. Forgive me. Geracchi was known as one of the best sculptors in the entire Western world. Americans and Europeans alike would go out of their ways to get a bust on themselves by the man. This man did everything in his power to get this commission, including something called artistic bribery. Yes, he would try to give busts of congresspeople and George Washington himself as gifts for an exchange of getting the commission. It was nothing but full-blown bribery, and these guys saw it a mile away.
We have been hoodwinked, bamboozled, led astray, run amok, and flat out deceived.
And according to the White House Historical Association, Cherokee asked for $300,000 to complete this commission. And I don't know if that's in today's money or money back then. Nonetheless, Congress just was like, we don't have that money at this point. We got to work on our national security. We got to work on infrastructure, stuff that, a fledgling nation needs to focus on. Becoming frustrated that no one would listen to his plans nor buy his busts anymore, Cherokee went back to Europe, where he would be part of a plot to kill Napoleon Bonaparte and then get the guillotine. The French engineer, Pierre-Charles L'Enfant, who is credited for the basic outlines of Washington, D.C. that we see today, included a location for the type of statue that the commission was looking for in his 1791 plans. And while Thomas Jefferson supported this type of monument, Congress and George Washington were reluctant to put money into it. There already was enough money being put into the original design, which had tons of public architecture. And get this. The original 1783 Equestrian George Washington Statue Commission was not completed until 1860 by a man named Clark Mills, which was based on this portrait of Napoleon Bonaparte. And the last sculpture I'll talk about is done by a man named John Antoine Houdon. Hopefully I'm pronouncing that correctly. Man, there's tons of Europeans in this episode. What'd I tell you? The sculpture was commissioned by the state government of Virginia in 1784. Sculpting began in 1785, signed in 1788. It was completed in 1791 or 2, it varies, and it was delivered in 1796, right when Washington was ending his presidency. This is known as one of the most realistic depictions of Washington that you will ever see because it's based on his life mask, and Houdon was diligent while taking the measurements of Washington's body. The original sculpture is located currently in the Richmond Rotunda of the state capitol, and it is the most extensively copied statue of Washington throughout the entire nation. I think this piece has been copied the most, not just because of its striking realism that Houdon did a masterful job on, but all the items he puts in the piece as well. He has Washington holding a cane and a plow, representing his time at Mount Vernon as a civilian, and he also has him with military garb on, a sword, and fasces, representing his military service to the Continental Army. And you might be thinking to yourself, fasces? Well, doesn't that symbolize fascism? Well, yes. But what it was in ancient Rome was a bundle of sticks with a hatchet in the middle, which was a symbol of ultimate power. And the reason why Houdon placed that in the sculpture was because Cincinnatus, the famous Roman dictator, who basically came off his farm to fight for the Roman Republic, relinquished his power after he was made dictator of Rome for, I think, a year or two. All these people back in the day read antiquity, and they compared Washington's actions of relinquishing power in both the military and the presidency to Cincinnatus. They even named a group called the Society of Cincinnatus after Washington that still exists today. In order to get in the group, you have to have an ancestor who was, I think, above an officer's rank during the American Revolution. Even the city of Cincinnati in Ohio is named after Washington in a sense because of this comparison. So what is the conclusion of all this that I want you, the viewer, to take in this part 1 of 3 series? The first thing is that America did not have the industrial capabilities yet to start creating a lot of metal and bronze statues that we see today. That's mostly in the mid-19th century, which I will get into part 2 and 3 later on. And that most of the marble and clay sculptures around during this time period were mostly made by Europeans and not Americans. And most Americans did not want to spend money on them at this point. I think the second major point as well is that the American Revolution changed the way people perceive power, not just politically, but in the public artwork sphere, and how both of them are tied and are very interconnected in many ways. That the culture that is created through art changes the way people perceive politics and society. And this is evident from the King George III statue. And I believe that George Washington and many of the founders, and including the early Congresses of the time, understood that they did not want to be in a position like Parliament and the King were during the Revolutionary War. And no one understood this dynamic more than Thomas Jefferson, who supported public arts and architecture, but when Aaron Burr shot and killed Alexander Hamilton on July 11, 1804, Jefferson understood that Hamilton now became a martyr, and because of that, Hamilton's ideas were going to become more prevalent throughout the United States, and Jefferson wanted to jump on top of that as quickly as possible. So he got himself and his allies to go and attack Hamilton's career and reputation. And ultimately, Jefferson won in his campaign against Hamilton's legacy, smearing Hamilton, saying he was a monarchist-loving Julius Caesar-type character. Now, of course, Hamilton was a lot more of a complex character than what Jefferson was depicting. But Jefferson was basically using that fervor against statues and memorials to monarchist-like characters from the Revolutionary War against Hamilton, basically using it as a shield. That's why you don't see a lot of statues to Hamilton outside of New York, and why his reputation really wasn't completely honored until the musical came out in 15 or 16. So yes, even in the 18th century, we see that the founders were having quarrels with one another about how they should be depicting themselves in American society, just like we are today. And for my final point, I want to address how we should be depicting George Washington's legacy today. I'll go into the American Revolution and the other founders in episodes 2 and 3 of this series. But for right now, I'm going to go into Washington because he was a big part of this episode. What I hope you saw in this Washington part of the entire episode is that Washington did not really like to sit down for a lot of sculptures. In fact, he was reluctant to do it every single time he sat down. And I think that says a lot about the man, because he understood history. He understood what happened with King George III's statue, although funny enough, he did not really approve of what the rioters did that day, but nonetheless, he understood what Roman emperors and dictators who were depicted up on high on a horse, what that meant to the rest of the people that they governed. He understood history, and I think that's something we really need to think about when we honor his legacy. We admire so many characteristics of Washington, his honesty, his bravery, courage, etc. But as an American society, we have forgotten his most important one, in my opinion, which is modesty. If we want to honor George Washington's legacy and honor his reputation, we should be as modest as he was. And when it comes to depicting him in our society, we have not been so modest. And in saying that, President Trump recently just did a very interesting interview with Fox News host Brian Kilmeade about the whole statue incident. And he said something very telling about Washington's legacy across the country.
But you can't take down George Washington's statue. And half of our country is named after Washington.
You heard that, correct? Half of our country is named after Washington. And he's not wrong. A lot of places are. And I think George Washington would kind of been disappointed about that. Because throughout his entire career, he never wanted the spotlight. He never craved the attention. He was about lifting other people up and giving other people credit when they deserved it. And I think in terms of giving other people credit throughout American history, we should be giving other people a chance in the spotlight. That doesn't mean I'm advocating for Washington, D.C. to be renamed or for all Washington statues to be taken down. I'm not saying that. What I am saying is places like Chicago or places on the West Coast maybe, where Washington never stepped foot in, maybe they don't need a statue there of him. They know who he is. They can open up a book and they can admire him like I am right now with my tie and my poster right here. They can do that. Putting statues of him in cities where he never even stepped foot in, like on the West Coast, makes no sense, and it makes him more look like an occupier rather than the father of our country. He should be shown in statue form in places where he actually made a difference and made effect, like at Mount Vernon or Independence Hall and certain places in New York City. That makes sense. Look, I'm not a fan of the presentist arguments that people make in terms of him owning slaves or certain practices that he did in the 18th century, because I think there's a lot of historical context that are being left of those conversations. But the memorialization of him in all 50 states and every single municipality of the United States is overkill. And frankly, I find it rich that partisan hacks like Tucker Carlson, who do not understand any of this history, are going to go and attack people who have a disagreement with him about having a Washington statue on every square inch of this country. Mr. Carlson, I challenge you to look at this video, and if you want to have a discussion with me or any other historian about this matter, I will be glad to talk to you about it. Because having a constructive dialogue on this and having facts is what's going to make us become a better nation, not just screaming at people and slandering them about different positions that you have. So take some time, let this information sink in, do your own research, comment, let me know what you think about this video, keep talking with your friends and family about the situation, share this video, and tune in next week for our next episode, which will be about the Marquis de Lafayette's tour of America from 1824 to 1825 and how it affected American memorialization. Thank you so much, everyone. Take care and stay safe.